So at this point now we have our graphics and we have the buttons and stuff. So now what we need to do is actually put the code in. So I'm going to make a new layer on the timeline here. Click on the little layer button there, and I'm just going to call it Actions with a capital A. And we are going to start, coding this thing. Okay. So what I want to have happen right off the bat, so I'm going to click on, make sure on layer 1 here, and click on just the first frame, just like that. Okay, so you might have to click off and then click back on, but just the first frame. Go to your actions, and we're going to use Code Snippets by clicking on this little button, and mine pop on down here, and we want to use the HTML5 canvas ones, timeline navigation, and I want to stop at this frame. Because right now if we play it just goes, just flies through. So I just want to initially just stop. Okay, and that is attached to the timeline. So if I actually click on the timeline, you'll see now there's a little A there. See a little A, and that little bit of code is referring to this one right here, this dot stop. So I'm just gonna like that. I just deleted the extra comment section. I don't really need that. Okay. So that's going to make it stop. Now the other thing I want to be able to do is have it that when I click on this button, it goes to the next frame and so on and so forth. So I'm going to click on this guy, on this button, and I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to open up my actions panel. I'm going to click on the, oops, hang on a second, got to go back here. Okay, we need to do one thing first. The way that the code's going to interact with this is it's going to use its instance name. It needs a name in order to know what is what. And I know it has a button called next button, but that's the symbol name. It's not the name it uses for the coding. It's actually going to use this up here. So I'm just going to we're just going to call it next. I think that's pretty easy. And I'm going to select this one, and we'll call this one previous. Okay. So those will be the two buttons. So I'm going to select this again. Actions, little code snippets, and timeline navigation. I want it to click to go to frame and stop. So I'm just going to double click on that, and it's going to write this little bit of code. Okay. Now, again, I'm going to get rid of this top part here. Okay. And what it does is it's going to automatically create what we call an event listener. In this case, it's going to create underneath this, which means this object, that this whole stage here. And then .next, which was that name that I made, that instance name. It's going to add this event listener, and the event listener is going to listen for a click, meaning when I click on the mouse, and then when it hears that click, it's going to run this function, click FL, go to frame, blah blah, and stop. It's just like it's just this right here. That pertains to this function. So when I click, it's going to run this function here. Now right now it says this dot go to and stop, and it's got frame 5. So if I click on it, it's going to go to frame 5. Let's go ahead, and I'm just going to change this to frame let's say 2. Okay. Now let's go ahead and run this. Control Enter. Give it a second, or Command Enter. Now you're going to notice when I click on this, it's going to go here. That's great, but watch. It doesn't do anything anymore. The reason why is that it's hard coded to go to this particular frame. So whenever I click on this button, it always goes to this one. Okay, so that doesn't really particularly work. Another thing I want to note is this. You'll notice that I said frame 2, right? This is frame 3, because in JavaScript the way the frames work is it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, it starts at 0, so just be aware that you need to do that. This is a little bit too far over. Let's get that closer so it's a little more symmetrical. Okay, so that's also not even the right number. Okay, so I'm going to make sure I click on my actions layer here. Make sure you're on frame 1 still. And basically what we need to do is have a way that when we click, it'll go to, we need to be able to dynamically change the number that's in here. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to need a variable that's just going to hold the frame number. So I'm just going to do variable var. It's going to be var. Whoops, hang on a second. Var, and we'll just say let's say cur for like current, fr for frame. So we'll say curve frame, right? We just need a name for that. And I'm gonna go ahead and initially set that value to 0 because the first frame we're gonna be on is gonna be 0, right? So that should be okay to start with, and then put a semicolon on the end of that, and there we go. So now, what I'm gonna have this do is this. I'm gonna have it this dot go to frame and stop, and I want it to go to, actually, you know what? Instead of doing current frame, let's call it next frame. Sorry, next. And we'll just write it out so it's a little bit easier. We'll call it next frame because that's the next frame I want to go to. I'm going to have it this dot go to and stop, and I'm going to write in here next frame. Okay, so it's going to go to the next frame. So tab, oops, actually enter. So in this case, when I go to click, it's going to go to next frame, and next frame starts off at 0. Okay, so what I need to do though is add to that each time I click. It's going to add to that, and then next frame is going to be, you know, plus another one. So we're going to go ahead and do next frame plus plus. And so what that's going to say is every time I click, I'm going to go click on that button, and it's go, okay, take the next frame, which is currently 0, and add 1. This is increment, right? So that number will become 1. Then it'll say this go to frame and stop next frame, which in my case will be 1, right? So then it'll go to the next frame, which will be this one here. Then if I click on it again, right, it's going to click, it's going to go down here, it's going to add 1 to it again, it's going to become 2. Then when I click and go to, it's going to go to frame 2. So now let's just hit Control Enter. All right, and if we click, you can see frame 2, 3, 4, right, and it'll scroll through. Now the reason why this works is because the way that Flash works is that when it gets to the end, it just restarts at the beginning, okay? Which is fine and dandy. However, that's actually not going to work when we want to go backwards, because when I get to the end, if I just write this code exactly like this, but for going the opposite direction, when we get to the end, it's just going to stop, because it can't go to a -1. So we actually need to apply a little bit more code here, okay? So I need to test a couple of things. So I need another variable that we're going to do that's going to say when the last frame is. So whatever the last one is, okay? So I'm going to do another variable, and we'll do variable, and we'll just call it total frames. And we'll set that equal to our total number, right? So in this case, if you remember, it starts at 0, so our total number is actually going to be 4, okay? But if you have more pictures, so like if I had 25 pictures, my total frames need to be 25. Okay, so this, you could just hard code it. I could write 4 all the time throughout this whole thing, or I can just use this, and that way if it changes, whenever I change the number up on the top here, it'll change all the way through. So that's why we're doing that. Okay, so now we need to make an if statement. So I'm just gonna move that down a little bit, and we're gonna have to test what frame we're on so we know where to go. So we're just going to go ahead and we're going to say if actually if I need to do this first. This next frame needs to happen before the if statement. Enter, Control V. So just take next frame and put it before this if statement. So when we click, it's going to do next frame, and we're going to say if next frame is greater than, we're going to say the total frames, then I'm going to want you to write this bit of code, okay, tab, oops, else you're going to run this bit of code, okay? So what we're saying is that if the next frame, so our total frames right here is 4, so if I go to click and it adds, and it's at 4, and it'll make it to 5, right? If I'm at frame 4 and I click on it, it'll go next frame plus plus, which will make it 5. And then I'll say if next frame is more than the total frame is 4, I'm going to want it to do what's in here, else it's going to just run like it normally does. So go ahead and take this one, what we already wrote, and Control X or Command X and Control or Command V. And so this is what it's going to do. As long as the next frame isn't larger than our total number of frames, it's going to, it's just going to go forward like it normally does. But if it is, I want to take my next frame and set that equal to 0. All right. We'll set it back to 0, and then we'll go ahead and we'll take this, Control C and Control V. So Control C is copy, so you can click, right click, copy, and then, you know, right click and paste if that's easier. And it'd be Command C or Command V, sorry, if it's okay. So this, go to and stop. So now, but if the frame is larger than the total numbers, it'll do the next frame, it'll set it back to 0, and then it'll go ahead and do this go to and stop. All right, so if we hit Control or Command Enter, just to test this real quick, bring it over here. It should do the exact same thing. It'll look exactly the same. It'll scroll right through it. So but it does tell me that it is working. Okay. The reason why I even need to set this up, if I was only doing one arrow going in one direction, I don't even need to worry about it. But in this case, I want to have a backwards arrow too. So, and I plan on just duplicating this code for the next bit. Okay. So that sets up going to the right. Now I want to set up going to the left. Okay. So to do that, I'm going to kind of do like I did before. I'm going to select this button here. I'm going to go to my Actions tablet or Actions panel, hit on the Code Snippets, and get click to go to frame and stop. Double click on that, and then I'll delete this bit here. And so now I got kind of the same thing I had up here, right, that we started with, but it doesn't have, it has the original go to frame and stop. That's not what I wanted to do. So I'm going to go ahead and the meat section of this, I'm going to delete that. And then this whole section inside of here, not the beginning bracket and the end bracket of this function, but the stuff in between. I'm going to copy that, right click, copy, right click, paste. Okay. So it's basically the same thing, but what I want to have happen here instead is that next frame we're going to decrement. So it goes opposite. So you do, let me move that out of the way, minus minus. Okay. So it'll take the next frame and whatever it currently, so let's say we're on frame 2. It'll subtract and make it so that the next frame is actually going to be 1. And for the most part, this will work. So the else will work fine because that's just going to go to the next frame after it's already decremented. However, and this is the whole reason why I needed to set it up for the other one, I need that when I get to frame 0, that it goes to the last frame here, right? So that it cycles through and goes back around to the other end. So we're going to go ahead and say if the next frame is less than, not the total frames, but less than 0. Okay, so meaning, because this is frame 0, so if it goes to -1, which there's nothing over here, right? Then the next frame is going to be the total frames. It's going to go ahead and make the next frame number not -1, but it's going to say, go ahead and make it what the total is, and my total frames is 4, which is what's the end here. Okay. Total frames, and then you go ahead and go to next frame. Okay, so it should look something like this. You can pause it and, you know, make sure yours looks the same. I'm just going to go ahead and hit Control Enter or Command Enter. Okay, and it's over here, of course. And now if I click, you can see it goes like that, and if I go this way, it'll go in reverse. And you'll notice that when I get to the end, this was my first frame, it will automatically know to go to the last frame. And then we've made a slideshow, okay? And you can make your own custom buttons and what have you, and all sorts of, you know, cool stuff, all right? So I'll do one more video after this one, just to show you, like, you can kind of animate each image popping up. Might be cooler to do. But for the most part, this functions